If you're interested in buying the Tata Safari or the Mahindra XUV700, chances are you know everything about these cars, the features, the specs, the space. But what you might not know is the fundamental difference in the driving characteristics of these two cars and what their real-world performance and fuel efficiency is like. And that's what we're going to address in this overdrive comparo. Starting with the new kid on the block, it's powered by a 2.2-litre 4-cylinder turbo diesel. It's got 185 PS and 415 Nm of torque. That comes in at about the same RPM as the Safari, though the power band is just a little wider. Peak power comes in a little earlier than the Safari too, and you can actually feel that difference because when you put your foot down flat, the XUV700 just takes off. It definitely feels like it's got more explosive performance under the hood. We have sampled this 2.2-litre M-Stallion engine before in the Thar and we loved it in that car. In the XUV700, it feels like it's even more refined, especially in comparison to the Safari. Overall NVH levels are very well contained, and this is a fairly refined engine, especially when you put the Safari into the mix. Whether you're driving in the city or out on the highway, getting back up to pace just feels a little more effortless in the XUV700. That combined with the fact that this engine generally does sound quieter and less stressed, it just results in a far smoother experience. The drive modes on the diesel 700 also make for a tailored experience with zip cutting power and smoothing out throttle response for easy city driving, and zap and zoom making for a more responsive powertrain. Though it does feel like the gearbox is a little slower to react than the Safari. Let's get the specs of the Safari out of the way first. It's a 2-litre 4-cylinder diesel engine, 170 PS, 350 Nm of torque, and a 6-speed automatic torque converter sourced from Hyundai. We know that the Safari is down on engine capacity, outright power, and torque. It's a 2-litre versus the 2.2. It's got 170 PS versus 185, and it's 350 Nm of torque versus the 450 that's available in the XUV700. It does use a 6-speed automatic transmission. It's a torque converter unit sourced from Hyundai, and it's very well mated to this engine. Therefore, it is slower than the XUV700 when it comes to outright acceleration. In our 0 to 100 kmph test, the Safari did it in a little over 11 seconds, where the XUV700 was a blistering quick 9.3, which is really saying something considering the size of these cars. It's also not likely that every owner is going to be taking part in traffic light drags, and in the all-important actual kickdown acceleration, the Safari hangs right in there with the XUV700. The biggest difference in the driving experience between these two cars actually comes from the fact that the Safari feels like a big SUV. You have a tiny bit more commanding driving position, like we said, but because of the fact that the steering itself is heavier, it does feel more substantive and it feels like a large SUV. Now, this could be a bad thing for relatively novice drivers in the city, where sometimes the Safari can feel like it's a handful, especially since you do need to put in a lot more effort at lower speeds to get the wheel turned. As for the actual turning radius though, both these SUVs are pretty evenly matched. What you will notice when you really put your foot down is that there is a little bit of a tug at the wheel in terms of torque steer, and the engine definitely sounds a lot more gruff than the engine in the XUV700. In terms of fuel economy, the larger engine XUV has the edge once again. It runs just a little more relaxed at highway speeds between 100 and 120 kmph. And in the city too, it generally feels just a little less stressed, considering it's running at under 2000 RPM most of the time. If you're driving the XUV700 for the first time, you'll definitely appreciate the light steering that feels near effortless at low speeds. When you're out on the highway, you do wish for just a little more because the XUV700 doesn't really have that big car feel. Now, this is a good thing for most people. It does feel like the car shrinks around you, and generally considering that the dash is lower set, these lighter colors, it all just feels like a smaller car. Where Mahindra have really excelled with the XUV700 is in its ride quality package. It's got McPherson struts up front, that's pretty normal, but it's got a multi-link setup at the rear, which is pretty special. It's made even more special by the fact that it's got frequency selective dampers made by Koni, who we know are suspension experts. This of course means that it works at low speeds, high speeds, small bumps, big bumps, everything. Now, the flip side to the near sublime ride quality that the XUV700 has is that it can feel a little soft, and it does get bent out of shape at speed breakers at slightly higher speeds than ideal. In comparison to the XUV700's fancy multi-link setup at the rear, the Safari's torsion beam doesn't sound all that impressive, and it shows in the micro vibrations that the car does let through, but overall it isn't an uncomfortable experience. Considering that it does damp some of the larger hits very well. In fact, that little extra firmness actually helps the Safari, especially when you're going over speed breakers, which can sometimes catch the XUV700 out, especially if you're at more than ideal speed. The Safari, you don't have to worry about that too much. You have none of that bucking that sometimes happens in the XUV. The heavier steering feel on the Safari also plays its part in giving it a slightly more confident edge when it comes to handling a set of twisties. It does roll, it does lean, but not as much as the XUV. But more importantly, it feels like it's more predictable at the edge. Sure, if you really throw it into a corner, especially on a dusty surface, you will feel it understeer, but it feels like it wants to grip and it wants to get back to traction a lot quicker and a lot more naturally than the XUV does. Driven back to back with the 700, it does feel like the Safari could do with a little more assistance at low speeds, often needing both hands to feed the wheel through U-turns, while the 700 could easily be swung around single-handed. If someone was looking for the most comfortable SUV, it would be the XUV700, but for someone looking for a little more SUV character, I think they might be able to make allowances for the Safari's ride quality. To briefly run through what's a highly personal choice, the XUV700 doesn't quite have the same road presence as the Safari. This even though the 700 is actually the longer SUV with a marginally longer wheelbase than the Safari. It would appear the wheels also play a part here, with the Safari's alloys looking more substantial and chunky even though they weigh similarly sized 235/60 18-inch tires. When viewed from the rear, the LED taillight signature on the 700 is very distinctive at night, but the Safari definitely shows its Land Rover genes with its split LED light signature placed high up. Speaking of lighting, the 700 has a huge advantage in its LED headlights and auto booster tech. These lights are amongst the very best we've ever driven with. The Safari's halogen projectors are a depth by themselves but aren't in the same league. What do you think of the styling of these two SUVs? We'd love to hear your take in the comment section. The first thing that strikes you about the XUV700's cabin is just how much lighter and airier it feels. The A-pillars, the same thickness, you get almost the same view out even though you are sat a little higher. The seats actually don't feel as comfortable as the ones in the Safari, though the upholstery might just be a little nicer. There is a lot of white leather, but it seems like it'll wear a little harder than the white leather that's in the Safari. This layout just feels more intuitive. There's space for two cups and it seems like they would be better held in place. There's more space for your phone up front. There's a wireless charging pad. The USB ports are easier to get to. There's a little bit of ambient lighting up here. There's even sunglass holders, and even the sunshades extend out. It does seem like Mahindra has definitely put a lot more thought into this cabin. They've had time to study the rivals and really come up with solutions for anything that you could have asked for. Now, there has been some niggles with the general infotainment system on the XUV700, I think just by virtue of how much it's trying to pack in. There is Alexa integration, there are apps on board, but currently Android Auto and Apple CarPlay isn't working. We're told that support for Android Auto is rolling out right now, even to customers, but we have no word on when Apple CarPlay will be supported. For everything that's really nice about the cabin, there are certain things, like for example, the rear view mirror is manually adjustable for dimming versus the electronic one in the Safari. And some of the plastics over here just don't feel as nice as they ought to. Jumping out of the XUV700 and into the Safari, you'll immediately realize that you just sit a little lower and this all black cabin takes a little getting used to. But if this is your preference, then you'd probably like the interiors better, though the white areas of trim and upholstery, they get dirty very easily. You'll also realize that you sit a little lower, and even though you sit lower, you get a feeling of a more commanding driving position. The steering wheel boss itself feels a little large and ungainly, though it is a very thick steering rim, and that gives you a little more of that true blue SUV feel. The instrumentation is a lot more basic. The same can be said for the infotainment system and the reverse camera, which only offers that one angle versus the XUV700's 360-degree camera. The storage also might not be as thoughtfully designed, though it does feel like there are certain materials like these perforated leather handles here and on the door, and even the door handles itself, that feel a little better. The quality of plastics, it's a toss-up between the two, but overall you won't feel shortchanged even in the Safari. What is worth noting is that there is a gold edition of the Safari that brings a few more features to the table, including ventilated seats up front and at the rear, and wireless Android Auto and Apple CarPlay. Now, it does come at a price, and whether it's worth it or not is up to you to decide. The airy cabin ambience continues into the second row, obviously, and there's a good amount of space here. Under-thigh support feels just a little better. There is about the same amount of knee room, but of course the Safari can be adjusted to your needs, and headroom feels a little less. This rear bench can be adjusted for recline, and you can get into a comfortable enough position. But what's worth noting is that the AC vents in the rear are situated in the center over here versus the B-pillar vents in the Safari. And if you've got a full house back here, these AC vents will probably be blocked by your middle passenger, so that's something worth noting. In the XUV, you can tilt the seat forward via a handy switch, so it should be good to be chauffeur driven around in, except for the fact that it feels like there's just a little too much lumbar support for you to really get comfortable in the seat. Aside from the slightly more elevated second row in the Safari, it is available with the option of captain seats, which immediately gives it a huge advantage if this is going to be your chauffeur-driven SUV. The other big advantage is the fact that the second row can be moved backwards for more space, and there's a huge amount of adjustment even in the angle of recline, so getting comfortable, especially over a longer journey, would be an absolute cinch. There aren't as many features back here, which is a theme that continues from the front of the cabin, but you can flip this seat down via a handy lever here, and overall it just seems more versatile. There's a ton more headroom. These seats, even though they're a little lacking in under-thigh support, actually let you sort of sink back into them, and that should make all the difference. Taller passengers are not going to be happy campers in the third row of the XUV700. Knee room is in very short supply because this can't be adjusted, and surprisingly headroom isn't really good enough for adults. Small kids maybe. Now you can adjust the angle of recline for the backrest, but it can only be done from a lever on the back, and of course you do eat into valuable boot space. So if you're trying to have enough boot space for a couple of suitcases, then you are going to be sat ramrod straight, and that's not going to be comfortable at all. Like the XUV700, there are blower controls with 3 fan speeds in the third row. Unlike the XUV700, I actually have headroom. There's a lot more space back here, even for someone who's my height. I'm 5'11", and this is with the seat just one notch ahead. I can find a happier compromise and get even more knee room. Of course, there's not under-thigh support, but then I think that would be expecting too much for an SUV of this size. Boot space in either is limited with all rows up, but the 700 offers just a bit more, which could be useful for stuffing more soft bags in. A quick summary between these two SUVs cabins would be that the 700 feels airier and more modern by virtue of all the tech and the lighter colors, while the Safari feels more spacious in all of the rows of seating, apart from feeling more SUV-like. The audio system performance in either is pretty good too, with the JBL setup in the Safari delivering good body and clarity, but the Sony setup in the 700 goes a little further in separation of the instruments thanks to the fancy DSPs and 3D surround presets. The 700 pulls out an advantage here with 7 airbags, where the curtain airbags extend right to the third row, to the Safari's 6 airbags, apart from all the ADAS tech, which includes forward collision warning / avoidance, automatic emergency braking, and lane keep assist, which all work pretty well even in our conditions. Only the 700 carries a GNCAP rating of an impressive 5 stars. Objectively, the XUV700 scores higher in almost all areas of consideration and is the wiser pick, the more modern pick, the smoother drive, the list goes on. That is, if you don't really need the third row space or if you can reconcile with its styling. But the Safari isn't far behind and to my eyes looks better. In a lot of ways, the Safari's faults are more like quirks, but more importantly, it's available. The 700's waiting times could put a lot of people off, and unless Mahindra can find a way to get ahead of the incredible demand, a lot of people may just settle for the Safari and they will be happy with it.